Hi everybody. I would like to apologize. I know you shouldn't start by saying any apology, but it's my modest title is so vague that it's not usual to have such a vague title for a conference paper. Modernism and nostalgia. It's a huge subject, of course, and the point is that this paper is rather general. We could see it as like an appetizer for an upcoming book or something like that. So it's not an exceptionally specific paper. But anyhow, in our understanding of nostalgia's refusal to accept the conditions of life, such as the flowing of time and the inevitability of extinction, as well as its inherent longing for space and time unreachable, we owe much to modernity, which fueled nostalgia with an unprecedented awareness of time and space. It's hardly radical to claim that modern nostalgia bears a significant relation to modernity. As identified by recent scholars, Kimberly K. Smith argues that nostalgia actually is the, quote, product of and indelibly shaped by 19th and 20th century conflicts over the political significance of the past. Likewise, Svetlana Boym, the modern concept of nostalgia originates in its reaction to modernity. Quote, at first glance, nostalgia is a longing for a place, but actually it is a yearning for a different time, the time of our childhood, the slower rhythms of our dreams. In a broader sense, nostalgia is rebellion against the modern idea of time, the time of history and progress, end of quote. This paper will investigate the relationship between modernity and nostalgia, as well as briefly sketch how this relation created a particularly literary nostalgic aesthetic in modern fiction. First, I will expand on the bifocal quality of the modernity and how this affected modern nostalgia. Then I will approach some distinct features of modernist literary nostalgia, divided into the sections space and time. The particular rapidity of change that swept over post-revolutionary Europe had an everlasting effect on how nostalgia was to be interpreted and perceived, and these interpretations and perceptions reached a climax in late modernism. Nostalgia became an emotion that very conveniently served as a playground for forbidden longings in a time that hammered out progress with each heartbeat. What then was the specific content of these changes? In the midst of the improvements of social affairs and lifestyle, a strong technological development, urbanization, emigration, a modernized administration and bureaucracy, new means of transport, communications and media, the explosive growth of newspapers and the world exhibitions all pushed society forward for a universally shared world. One of the consequences of this globally shared world was an emphasis on clock time through regulated time zones and timetables. The age of modernization was the time of contrasts, of conflicts between the old and the new. Maybe this time even could be described as schizophrenic, as Karen Johannesson suggests, an interior break as a result of living in two different worlds at the same time. Jay Gatsby's peculiar and pathetic gesture in The Great Gatsby, stretching out his hand desperately towards the past, emblematizes both modern nostalgia's teleological concern and entropic vision of modernity and the melancholia and pain involved in this retrospection. Another potent and illustrative interpretation of this schizophrenia is Walter Benjamin's famous and almost apocalyptic description of Paul Klee's Angelus Novus. A storm, this is a quote from Benjamin, a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. The dichotomy between progress and longings for the past that is so inherent in modernity is here expressed elegantly by the angel of history, who reluctantly moves towards the future without any opportunity to stop and reflect and heal what has been lost in the past. Immanent in this dichotomy was a strong longing for the past times and the slower rhythms of the past, for continuity, social cohesion, and tradition. If being modern was to be part of a universe in which, as Karl Marx said, all that is solid melts into air, then being nostalgic was a symptom of poor adaptability to the modern way, and as such was a despicable disease in the eyes of progress. Nostalgia became conservative and reactionary in the age of rationalization. Rationality had been temporarily halted by the Romantics. Francis Hutcheson, in his essay on the nature and conduct of the passions and affections, asserts that there was no space for the kind of emotions that were considered wild, physical, and unsound. Only emotions that motivated action, such as greed, jealousy, and vanity, were respectable. That led to a division not between rationality and feeling, but rather between emotion as something sound and passions as something dismissible. As such, nostalgia, being a passion, was discarded from the rationality project and became a crack in the modern world. Assessing critically the effects of the modern world of progress is part of the whole project of modernity, and is why we can see a heightened interest in anti-progressive nostalgia both in general discourse and art in the age of modernity. Quote, "Modernity and modernisms," writes Boehm, "are responses to this condition of modernization and the consequences of progress. This modernity is contradictory, critical, ambivalent, and reflective on the nature of time. It combines fascination for the present with the longing for another time." End of quote. Similarly, Georg Simmel, in his groundbreaking dissection of modern life, asserts that there was an aspect of modernization that interfered with human well-being. The suspicions towards progress were finally confirmed by the consequences of the Great War, which generated further nihilism and pessimism over the conditions of life, as well as an even stronger longing for the pre-war world. The war is the main reason, as we will see later, why late modernism reacted stronger and more evasive against progress than earlier literary movements. You could say that the Great War melted all that was solid into air, and that all that remained was to look back for a time when the world still was intact. Now, let's go into nostalgic aesthetics. This is a picture of a cover of To the Lighthouse. Although nostalgia can be considered conservative or reactionary as an idea, the influence it had on modernist literary style is, on the contrary, quite radical. Since, as we have seen above, nostalgia was associated with anti-rational feelings and expressions, the use of nostalgia became, in fact, a rebellion against the ideas of progress and the project of rationality. It also became a highly personal strategy to handle the loss of faith in humanity and a sense of transcendental homelessness. In a post-Nietzschean world, there was a strong need to find tradition and stability. The spiritual homes were either the past or the utopia, which really are the same thing. These reactions necessitated an aesthetic that could handle nostalgic emotions in a profound way. Since the modern writers were also very aware that they were modern, they invented or reworked a style that suited their thematic concerns. This literary style was strongly influenced also by contemporary philosophy, science, psychology, sociology, and economy. From Bergson, they adapted ideas of anachronism and subjective time. Einstein's theories of relativity confirmed the general skepticism of totalitarian ideas and further enhanced notions of a lack of truth and value. The interior landscape that is inherent in a nostalgic experience found its expressions in free and direct discourse and stream of consciousness, inspired by William James and Freud's dependence on consciousness and the past. A general criticism of progress and how it was inevitably linked to capitalism, found its inspiration from Marx and Engels. One of the most obvious and recognized modernist nostalgic techniques is what I call ontological nostalgia. It's a structural departure to an idealized space or time, either as a dream or a memory of the past. This space is set as a binary reaction to the unpleasant present, a longing from a now to a then or there. The world remembered is utopian equality, often described in romantic pictorial terms or as an innocent, almost Rousseauan adolescent place. Its ontological dimension lies in its idealized or unrealistic quality that is clearly set aside from the real world. Ontological nostalgia is a crucial component in the aftermath of the Great War, in particularly British literature, addressing the feeling of a distinct rupture between the Edenic Edwardian age and the post-war 1920s. Obviously, the war created in its cruelty not only to people's real lives, but also to the ideas of progress, a strong longing back to the old world, a world of security, tradition, and order. If we in Romantic poetry distinguish a desire to return symbolically to a time before industrialization, a time of freedom and innocence, the British modernists are often content with the less mystic Edwardian era, their Belle Epoque. Even though these years belong to a not too distant memory for the modernists, they still addressed it with a romantic spark. This rupture could not have been expressed with stronger emphasis than through Mrs. Ramsay's sudden death in brackets in Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. The death, as well as the whole middle chapter in which it occurs, titled Time Passes, becomes a structural break in the narrative, clearly dividing the story in before and after the war. Although not entirely uncritical to the Victorian manners of pre-war Britain, to say the least, what remains is still an idyllic, airy, sunny garden that is constantly revoked by the surviving characters in the final chapter. Similar strategies are employed by Rebecca West in The Return of the Soldier, where the shell-shocked hero returns mentally to a pastoral island of his younger years. Ontological nostalgia can also include whole novels, for example, like James Joyce's Return to Dublin, dated the 16th of June 1904. And the war's influence on the ruptured narrative was, of course, not a singularly British experience. Marcel Proust's pre-war bucolic Gourmandie was constructed not only to illustrate the innocent remembrance of childhood, but also to juxtapose the destructive consequences of the war with the pre-war era. Thomas Mann in Der Zauberberg similarly constructs his narrative around the Great War, but where Proust or Woolf yearns for a lost time and space, Mann seems ironically to paint a pre-war world that actually is responsible for the battlefields and the trenches in an ideological manner. The crucial element of nostalgia is undeniably the time arrow. The irreversibility of time and the fading of all stable molecules around us, whether that is a sandcastle, a human life, or the universe. Most of the nostalgic tropes owe something to the teleological aspect of time, an aspect that was, as I mentioned before, closely related to the emergence of globally controlled time. It is not a coincidence that the anarchist in Joseph Conrad's The Secret Agent plans to blow up Greenwich Observatory as an act against clock time itself. The famous dichotomy between clock time and inner time, or Bersonian duration, has proven a common strategy to exploit teleological aspects of nostalgia. The occurrence of time markers flagging clock time as an impatient but steady beat towards decay and death are common enough. The most famous example is the use of clock time in Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, where the recurring sound from Big Ben constantly reminds the reader of the time arrow, and this in turn becomes a huge construct to the subjective Bersonian time of the characters, which enables a temporality that fights against clock time. Time markers can thus be as simple as a reminder of clocks, as in Mrs. Dalloway, or time experienced by its characters, such as Dick Diver listening to time while listening to the buzz of the electric clock in Fitzgerald's Tenderest Night. Another potent literary nostalgic strategy is the use of anachronisms. and analepsis or flashbacks in particular. Nostalgic analepses approach our sensations through use of the onomatopoetic and through synesthesia, where language tries to trigger other sensations such as taste, smell, and hearing. This is predominantly done in order to seduce the reader into the phenomenology of memory and nostalgia, which rather resides within other sensational contexts than merely the text. Triggering sensations of sounds and smells in addition to the visual details all work toward intensifying the temporal leap. There has to be something that boosts the temporal departure and somehow fulfills the nostalgic ideal of past and present incurably inseparable. The transition into past times becomes so effectual in Mrs. Dalloway since Lady Bruton's nostalgia is evoked by the transitional sounds of summer childhood. This is then a quote from Mrs. Dalloway. She sighed, she snored. Not that she was asleep, only drowsy and heavy, drowsy and heavy. Like a field of clover in the sunshine this hot June day, with the bees going round and about and the yellow butterflies. Always she went back to those fields, down in Devonshire, where she had jumped the brooks on Patty, her pony. And there were the dogs, there were the rats, there were her father and mother on the lawn under the trees. The important difference here between pure memory and nostalgia lies in the non-specificity of the memory, which is evoked by the iterative effect. She had not jumped the brooks on Patty once, but several times. There were cats around, not once, but always. Her parents used to sit under the trees. We see an absence of decisive time markers or singular occurrences, and instead a vagueness that resembles nostalgic memory. Analepsis can also be used as a structural narrative strategy. The analeptic structure suggests a frame structure where a narrator subsequently narrates the events of some past imagination or experience, thus creating a distinct now and then on which he is liable to comment. The use of first-person narration further stimulates the private nature of the recollection and aids the seductive qualities of the narration. It grants the narrator a greater freedom in rearranging the temporal order of events. A prime example of a novel that uses the analytic structure is Evelyn Waugh in Brighthead Revisited, where the protagonist subsequently laments his earlier archaic Oxford days. In this paper, I have tried to sketch in a few brief examples how a particular nostalgic aesthetic developed out of the pressures that modernization, rationalization, and progress sustained on modernist writers. The sense of transcendental homelessness, impaired with nihilism and universal grief, that was accentuated through the war and contemporary ideas, necessitated a literary style that both confronted the whole project of progress, as well as provided a playground for emotions that were not considered desirable in a world moving distinctly forward. In a way, the modernist writers did deal with the pile of debris that the angel of history was unable to attend to. The nostalgic inclination in modernism has been discussed widely, but my contribution here is to try to illustrate more concrete effects of this inclination in terms of style and form. Literary style borrows and inspires. Ancient romantic ruins transform into rusty plows, and once upon a time becomes in my younger and more vulnerable years. But somewhere in that modern debris, the modernists also found a unique opportunity not only reinvent, but also truly invent a literary aesthetic that both suited their creative elitism and embraced the new temporal and spatial experience of modern man. Thank you.
Can I